fell in the rain. She held her mother's papers against her chest while the man in the black car watched. He had seen hardship before, but not this kind of quiet proof. What makes a silent witness finally speak? Field. Elena Brooks was already wet before she reached the first crosswalk. The rain had found its way through the shoulders of her black blazer, down the back of her collar, through the cuffs of the elfie the night for the blouse she had ironed the night before with the flat bottom of a saucepan. She kept one arm locked around the waterproof folder, pressed to her chest. With the other hand, she held the strap of her bag close, as if the whole morning might come apart if she loosened her grip for even a second. Across the street, behind the dark glass of a black car, Arthur Hale watched her, meant to watch her for as long as he did. At first, she had simply been another figure in the rain, a young woman hurrying toward the city offices with her head down and her shoes splashing through the water along the curb. But then he noticed the way she held the folder, not under her arm, not casually. Against her chest, with the blazer, protected by her own body, Arthur sat perfectly still in the back seat. The car was warm. The windows were beginning to fog at the edges. Rain tapped against the roof in a steady, impatient rhythm. The driver had left the engine running low enough that the heat barely made a sound. Arthur's coat lay folded beside him. His briefcase rested on the floor near his shoes. The seat next to him was the thin folder the city had sent over for that morning's housing hearing. He had read the summary twice. A contested apartment, old tax debt, a pending auction, the young claimant with incomplete records, the kind of case he had seen too many times to count, the kind of case that usually ended the same way. Outside, the woman stepped around a deep puddle and nearly lost her footing. Her right hand flew toward the folder. First, not the railing, not the wall, not the strap of her bag. She steadied the papers before she steadied herself. Arthur's fingers tightened once on the handle of his briefcase. Fueled. He could have lowered the window. He could have told the driver to pull forward. He could have offered her the short ride to the city housing office, which was only a few blocks away. But he did none of those things. He had spent most of his professional life believing that distance made a person fair. Distance kept the law clean. Distance kept pity from turning paperwork into favors. So he stayed where he was, dry and silent, being a woman he did not yet know fight the weather for the right to be heard. Elena did not see him. She saw only the slick sidewalk, the gray shape of the city offices ahead, and the folder beneath her arm. Inside that folder were copies Nora Whitman had helped her scan at the library the evening before. Tax notices, payment receipts, a letter from the building office, a copy of her mother's name still tied to the apartment in one place, and missing from it in another. None of it looked like enough when laid out on a table, but it was what she had. Nora had stayed after closing to help her, Fiersman. The older woman had not made a speech about hope. That was one of the reasons Elena trusted her. Nora simply unlocked the little office behind the circulation desk, turned on the scanner, said there was no shame in making extra copies when the people across the table had printers, lawyers, and time. Elena had stood there under the fluorescent library lights, while each page through the machine, one by one, filled. If the sound of scanning could somehow make the facts more solid, you keep the originals close, Nora had told her, and you don't let anyone rush you. Elena had nodded. Iran, though she knew being rushed was exactly what she feared most. At home, Marcus had pretended not to notice the papers spread across the kitchen table. He was 17, tall enough now that his sleeves were always a little short, still young enough to leave cereal bowls in the sink and believe silence could protect the people he loved. He had asked if she needed help with anything. Not what the hearing was about. Not why she had stayed up so late. Whether she needed help. Elena had smiled too quickly and told him to focus on school. He had gone quiet after that. When she reached for her bag that morning, she found a folded slip of paper tucked beside the folder. His handwriting was uneven, written in a hurry, but the words were clear. "Bring Mom home with you." She had read it once, then folded it again and placed it inside the front pocket of the folder. She had not let herself cry. There had been no time for crying. There had been only the apartment, the rain, the hearing, and the dangerous little she had been telling Marcus for weeks. That everything was under control. Nothing was under control. The apartment was the last piece of their mother that had not been boxed, donated, away, or buried. It had the narrow kitchen where she used to hum while paying bills at midnight. It had the window Marcus had taped paper snowflakes to every winter. It had the hallway wall where the old marks of their heights still climbed upward in pencil. To the city, the unit, with unpaid tax history and disputed paperwork. To Elena, it was the place where her mother still seemed possible. If she failed that morning, the apartment could be cleared for auction. Not someday, in some far-off way that gave a person time to get used to the idea. Soon enough that every room already felt borrowed. The wind pushed rain into Elena's face as she crossed the next block. She lowered her chin and kept moving. Her shoes were not made for weather like this. They slipped slightly on the wet pavement, and each careful step cost her time. She checked the streetlight, then the folder, the sound, the entrance to the housing office ahead. She was late enough to worry and early enough to keep going. That was the narrow space her life seemed to exist in lately, behind the black car window, found. Arthur watched her pause under the shallow overhang of a closed storefront. She did not stop long, just enough to adjust the folder, wipe rain from her eyes, and press the packet more firmly against her blazer. Practical movement, a tired movement, not dramatic, not pleading. That bothered him more than if she had looked desperate. Desperate people were easier to categorize, fit neatly into the old language of hearings and hardship forms. This woman did not look like she had come to beg. She looked like she had come to prove something no one wanted to take the time to read. Her looked down at the hearing folder beside him. Brooks. That was the name, printed on the top sheet. He looked up again. The woman in the rain had started walking faster. Something in him shifted, but not enough to move him yet. Arthur had trained himself for too many years to mistake hesitation for wisdom. He told himself there were rules. He told himself he did not know the full case. He told himself stepping in before the hearing would be improper. All of that was true. None of it explained why he felt ashamed. Elena reached the last stretch of sidewalk, leading toward the city housing office. The building rose ahead of her, with its pale, stone front and wide glass doors, the kind of place where people lowered their voices without being asked. She slowed for only a moment. Not because she was afraid of the building, she was. Not because she was tired, though the rain had made every step heavier. She slowed because once she walked through those doors, she would have to stop being a sister, a daughter, a tired woman in a wet blazer. She would have to become a file, a claimant, a problem to be processed before lunch. Her hand moved once over the front of the folder, feeling the shape of Marcus's folded note beneath the plastic. Bring Mom home with you. He breathed in, held it, and took another step. Inside the black car, Arthur leaned forward without meaning to. Through the wet glass, he saw the folder hugged to her chest, saw the way her shoulders squared as the entrance came closer, saw the strange care with which she protected those papers from the rain as if they were alive. For the first time that morning, he wondered not what the file said about her, but what it had failed to say. The driver glanced at him in the mirror. "Sir?" Arthur did not answer. Elena climbed the first step toward the housing office doors, and water dripping from the edge of her blazer or onto the stone beneath her feet. Arthur's hand moved toward the door handle, then stopped. He watched her go in, with the folder still pressed to her heart. And still, he did not step out, feel blown. The warmth inside the city housing office did not feel kind. It hit Elena in the face the moment she passed through the glass doors, turning the rain on her blazer from cold water into a damp heaviness that clung to her shoulders. Her shoes made small wet marks on the polished floor. A few people waiting near the reception desk glanced up, away, in the quick, practiced way strangers do when they do not want to be caught. Noticing someone's hardship, Elena kept walking, The waterproof folder stayed against her chest until she reached the intake counter. Only then did she set it down, carefully, as if placing something breakable on an altar. The woman behind the desk looked from Elena's wet sleeves to the folder, then down at the appointment list. Name? Elena Brooks. The woman typed, clicked, waited for the screen, and slid a clipboard toward her. Housing review. Room 3. They're running close to schedule, so don't go far. Elena nodded and took the clipboard. Fingers were still stiff from the rain. The pen slipped once before she caught it. She wrote her name, the apartment number, her phone number, and the case reference from memory. He had repeated that number so many times in the past week that it no longer felt like a number. It felt like a label someone had tied around the neck of her mother's home. Across the lobby, her Hale entered through the same glass doors. He did not come in behind her so closely that anyone would connect them. He shook rain from the sleeve of his coat, folded his umbrella with slow precision, stood for a moment near the directory on the wall. To anyone watching, he was only an older man arriving for a city appointment. Neat coat, gray hair, briefcase, the kind of man clerks spoke to with a different voice before they even knew his name. Elena did not see him. She was reading the notice tacked to the clipboard, final review, pending transfer, auction eligibility, words, sat on the page without mercy. She handed the clipboard back and moved toward the waiting area outside room 3. The chairs were hard, lined in 2 rows against a beige wall. A water cooler stood in the corner with a stack of Papes cups beside it. On the bulletin board were flyers about tenant rights, heating assistance, mediation services, and a workshop that had taken place weeks ago. Every flyer promised help in soft colors. Every person in the room looked as if they had already learned how little a promise could weigh. Elena chose a chair near the end of the row, not too close to the door, not too far. She set the waterproof folder on her lap and opened it just enough to check the first set of scanned copies. The pages were dry. The ink was clean. Nora's careful work had held. That should have comforted her. Instead, beat her. How thin the line was between prepared and powerless. A man in a dark overcoat sat across from her, speaking quietly to another man beside him. The second man had a leather portfolio and the relaxed posture of someone who expected the morning to go his way. Elena recognized him from the brief introduction printed on one of the city letters. Grant Miller. Interested buyer. Looked like a villain. That almost made it worse. He looked polite, rested, unbothered. His shoes were dry, his coat was dry, and when he glanced at Elena's damp blazer, his face changed only slightly, enough to be rude. Just enough to let her know he had noticed and filed it somewhere in his mind. A woman with a folder under her arm stepped out of room 3 and called, "Brooks, review." Elena rose too quickly. Folder slid on her skirt, and she caught it against her hip. Grant rose at the same time. So did the man with the leather portfolio. For one brief second, 3 of them stood in the narrow hallway as if they were all there for the same reason. They were not. Grant gave her a small nod. "Miss Brooks?" "Elena," she said, before she could stop herself. His smile did not move much. Of course. Room 3 was smaller than she had expected. A long table filled most of it. At one end sat Denise Carter, the city housing employee assigned to the file. Fear us. Denise looked tired in the way people look tired when their work never, only changes names. A computer screen glowed in front of her. Beside it lay a thin printed packet. Arthur was already seated slightly off to the side, behind the table exactly, but near enough to be part of the room. Elena noticed him then, the older man from the lobby. She did not know he was the same man from the car. She only saw the briefcase, the composed hands, the stillness of someone who had watched many rooms like this decide many lives. Denise gestured to the chair facing the table. "Miss Brooks, you can sit there." Elena sat. He placed the waterproof folder squarely in front of her. Not on the floor, not in her lap. On the table, Grant and his representative, seats to her right. Their papers made a soft, expensive sound when the portfolio opened. Lied. Denise cleared her throat. "This is a final administrative review regarding the apartment formerly held under your mother's name, and the outstanding municipal balance attached to the unit. We're here to determine whether there is sufficient documentation to delay the pending auction process. Formerly held. Elena felt the phrase land in her chest. My mother lived there for almost 20 years, she said. Her voice was steady, though she could feel the damp collar of her blouse against her neck. My brother and I still live there. Denise looked at the screen. I understand. But the legal question today is not occupancy, these resent. If the balance was satisfied, or whether there is documented error in the current record, Grant's representative leaned forward with professional calm. And as we understand it, the city record shows the balance remained unresolved after multiple notices. Elena opened her folder. I have copies of payments. Some are partial, but they show she was paying. Denise held out a hand. Vina passed over the first packet. It was the scanned set Nora had helped prepare, clipped in order as best as Elena knew how. Denise looked through them, not carelessly but quickly, too quickly for Elena's comfort. A page per page. A glance at the computer. A frown. These are not all reflected in the digital ledger, Denise said. That's why I brought them. I understand that. But some of these are notices. Some are handwritten references. These two payments don't show a matching confirmation number. They were made through the community payment desk, Elena said. The one that closed. My mother didn't pay online. Denise's mouth tightened. Not unkindly, Vini. More like a person hearing something inconvenient but not new. That desk has been closed for some time. Records from that period were transferred into the system. Not all of them, Elena said. Representative folded his hands. With respect, Miss Brooks, the issue is whether the city can verify them. Personal copies are not the same as recorded settlement. Personal copies. Elena looked down at the pages. Her mother had kept them because she had believed keeping paper meant keeping proof. Elena had believed that too. Now, in this small room, the copies seemed to shrink under the weight of words like recorded and settlement and eligibility. Arthur said, Nothing fancy. He watched Elena's hands. They were still, but only because she had pressed them flat against the folder. He noticed the wet edges of her sleeves. He noticed the way she listened to every word, as if missing one might cost her the apartment. He had seen people come into hearings angry, loud, resigned, confused. Elena was none of those things. She was holding herself together with preparation that was harder to dismiss. Denise returned the packet. Miss Brooks, I don't doubt that your mother attempted to address the balance. The system currently shows the account remained delinquent beyond the allowed window. The system is wrong. The room went quiet. Elena had not raised her voice. That made the sentence feel even sharper. Denise looked at her over the top of the screen. I need documentation that proves that. This is documentation. It is supporting material, Denise said carefully. Not sufficient on its own. Grant shifted in his chair. The timeline has already been delayed once. My client has complied with every step required. We are sympathetic to Ms. Brooks's situation, but there has to be finality. Finality. There it was. Clean word for losing the kitchen, where her mother had paid bills. A clean word for Marcus's paper snowflakes. A clean word for strangers walking through rooms Elena had not yet figured out how to empty. She opened the folder again and drew out the auction notice. It had arrived in a white envelope with no kindness in it. Seeing it on the table made the room feel smaller. This notice says, if the review doesn't stop it, the apartment moves forward, she said. Denise nodded. That is correct. How soon? Denise hesitated. The process would continue without another administrative delay. Grant's representative added, is what the record supports. Elena looked at him then, not with anger. Anger would have been easier. He looked at him with the exhaustion of someone who had walked through rain to be told that the rain was not part of the file. Arthur saw the look and lowered his eyes to the packet in front of Denise. Improper about the room. That was the trouble. Everyone was seated. Everyone was speaking in order. No one had shouted. No one had insulted her. The harm, if it came, would arrive cleanly, through procedure, find, and dated. Denai clicked through the ledger on her screen. I can give you a few minutes to identify any additional matching documentation in what you brought. But based on what has been presented so far, the grounds to recommend holding the file. Grant's hand moved toward his portfolio. Not a large movement, just a quiet preparation. The kind a person makes when he believes the meeting is almost over. Felt something inside her go very still. She had brought the scanned copies, the notices, the letters. The payment slips Nora had helped her organize. She had done what people told you to do when you were trying not to lose. Copies. Show up, stay calm, tell the truth. And still, the room was leaning away from her. Her fingers touched the edge of the waterproof folder. Beneath the clipped packets, beneath the plastic sleeves, the paperwork she had thought would matter most. There was one thing she had almost left at home, Vex's old library borrowing record, folded inside a worn little booklet from years back. Not official enough, she had told herself the night before. Too personal, too strange, too much like bringing a piece of her mother into a room that only wanted numbers. But Marcus's note was tucked near it now. Bring Mom home with you. Peace began gathering the top pages. Grant's representative slid a document halfway out of his portfolio. Alina reached into the folder before she could talk herself out of it. Wait, she said. Her voice was quiet, but everyone heard it. She moved the scanned packets aside and pulled out the old library booklet, its corner soft from years in a drawer, its cover protected now by the same waterproof sleeve that had kept it dry through the rain. For the first time that morning, Arthur's eyes did not go to the computer or the city packet or the auction notice. They went to the small worn booklet in Alina's hand, and something in his face changed. The room seemed to draw closer around the little booklet. Alina placed it on the table with both hands, not because it was heavy, because it felt too personal to slide across like a regular document. The cover was faded at the corners, softened from years of being opened and closed by someone who had believed in keeping things. Her mother had kept grocery lists in old envelopes, coupons in coffee tins, appointment cards in the back of cookbooks. Alina used to tease her for it. Now all that careful saving sat between her and the loss of their home. Denise looked at the booklet, then at Alina. What is that? It was my mother's library borrowing record, Alina said. She kept things inside it. Grant's representative let out a patient little breath. Be kind, meant to sound polite while making everyone in the room feel time being wasted. Ms. Brooks, unless it contains city-issued payment confirmation, I don't see how. It contains receipts, Alina said. Voice was not loud. It did not need to be. The word receipts changed the air more than shouting ever could. Denise's hand paused above the keyboard. Arthur, who had been sitting slightly apart from the table, forward just enough that the movement was visible, but not dramatic. Grant noticed. Alina noticed too, though she did not understand why. She opened the booklet. Inside were thin slips of paper, folded carefully and pressed flat over the years. Some were yellowed. Some had edges worn soft. A few had been tucked so deep into the booklet that Alina had nearly missed them when she first found it. Beautiful things. They had no power in the way legal papers seemed to have power. They were small, ordinary records of small, ordinary payments, but they had her mother's stubbornness in them. Alina removed the first receipt and laid it on the table. This one matches the spring notice, she said. The amount is partial, but the reference number is written here. Denise drew it closer without touching it fully, as if old paper might accuse her. This isn't printed in the same format as the others. It was from the community payment desk, Azina said. Before everything moved online, Denise looked at the screen. The desk records should have been transferred. But they weren't, Alina said. At least not all of them. Grant shifted in his chair. A handwritten note on an old receipt doesn't establish that the balance was resolved. No, Anna said. And this time she looked at him. That's why there's more than one. She set down another slip. Then another. The table, which had belonged to the city a moment earlier, slowly became her mother's table, place where payments had been laid out, counted, worried over, and saved. Elena did not scatter the receipts. She arranged them in order, the way Nora had taught her to arrange documents at the library. Oldest to newest, as to payment, payment to next notice. Her fingertips trembled once, but she kept going. Arthur watched the sequence form. At first, he watched as a professional. The old habit returned easily. Date, amount, stamp, reference. He had spent years reading lives in those fragments and pretending they were not lives at all. A missing number meant uncertainty. A late date meant delinquency. A partial payment meant insufficient action. It had all sounded so clean when spoken from behind a desk. Then Elena placed the fourth receipt in the row. Arthur's eyes fixed on the lower corner. A square stamp, faded but legible enough. A clerk's initials near the edge. Beneath it, not quite centered, a signature he had not seen in many long years, his own. The sound in the room thinned. Denise was still speaking, but Arthur did not hear the first few words. He was no longer in room 3. He was back in another office, another season, another stack of files waiting to be cleared before the end of the day. He remembered the stamp pads that dried out too quickly, the forms that piled high, pressure to move cases along, because there were always more cases, always more names, always more units, always more balances that did not quite line up. He had signed hundreds of papers like that, the unfind. He had signed them believing the system would catch what he missed. Once, it had not. A family had lost a home because a paper payment had sat in the wrong tray, and no one had slowed down long enough to look, or had not been cruel that day. That was what had haunted him most. He had been inefficient. He had been correct according to the screen. He had been busy. The memory rose so sharply that his hand closed around the arm of his chair. "Mr. Hale," Denise said. Arthur looked up. Everyone was looking at him now. Elena followed his gaze back to the receipt. She saw the old stamp, the signature, the way his face had changed from distance to something heavier. She did not know the history behind that look. She only knew that, for the first time since she entered the room, someone at the table seemed to understand that the papers were not clutter. They were proof of effort. Denise reached for the receipt more carefully this time. "This stamp is from the old desk." Arthur did not answer right away. It for giant. Grant's representative turned a page in his portfolio, trying to reclaim the room. "Even if the receipt is authentic, we would still need to establish that the payments were applied to the specific balance in question. We cannot delay a pending transfer based on unrelated fragments." "They are not unrelated," Elena said. She pulled another paper from the booklet, then a folded notice that had been tucked behind it. The notice showed the same balanced range as the receipt, not exact enough to end the matter. Close enough to make dismissal harder. "This one came after that payment," she said. "The amount went down. Not by enough, but went down. Then this next one went up again after the fee was added." Denise's expression changed in small degrees. The tired certainty she had carried into the room began to crack, not into sympathy, but into concern. Concern was better. Sympathy could be brushed aside. Concern required action. "May I see the booklet?" Denise asked. Elena hesitated. It was quick, but Arthur saw it. So did Denise. Elena had handed over copies all morning. He had let them examine scans, notices, packets, paper that could be replaced. But this booklet had lived in her mother's hands. It had been kept in a drawer, carried through grief, nearly left behind, because it seemed too small for a room like this. Giving it up, even across a table, felt like letting someone touch the last private corner of her mother's life. Denise softened her voice, just slightly. "Keep it on the table." Elena nodded once and slid it forward. Denise opened it with more care than she had shown any of the other documents. She checked the folds, the order, the stamps. She turned to her computer and began searching through the ledger again. Slower this time. Grant no longer looked relaxed. "With respect," he said, "this hearing has a defined scope, Theo. The buyer has followed the process as presented." Arthur's eyes moved to him. "The process as presented," Arthur said, his first words in several minutes, "may not be the process as completed." Representative sat straighter. Denise stopped typing. Elena did not move. Arthur's voice had not risen, It had not warmed either, but something in it had changed. The neutral edge was gone. In its place was an old caution, and that comes when a person recognizes the shape of a mistake, before it becomes permanent. Denise looked back at the screen. There are missing transfer entries from the old desk period. Grant's representative said, missing entries don't prove payment. No, Arthur said. But a stamped receipt tied to a matching notice means the missing entries cannot be ignored. Elena looked down at the row of slips on the table. For the first time that morning, they did not look like scraps. They looked like a line of witnesses. She reached into the waterproof folder again and removed the scanned copies Nora had made. She placed them beside the originals. These are the scans, she said. The originals are in the booklet. The copies are in order. Denise glanced at the clean copies, then the old slips. You prepared these? A librarian helped me scan them, Elena said. The mother kept them. That was the sentence that nearly broke her voice. Not because it was dramatic, because it was plain. Her mother had kept them. Through notices, through partial payments, through fees, through confusion, through the kind of shame that makes people bills in drawers and then pull them out again. At midnight. She had kept proof that she had tried. Denise lowered her eyes. Representative tapped one finger against his portfolio. The city cannot halt a transfer every time someone finds old paper in a drawer. Arthur turned toward him fully then. No one has asked the city to halt anything because of old paper, he said. She is asking the city to examine whether its own record failed to include payments it accepted. The words landed with more weight than anger would have carried. Elena did not know whether to feel relief or fear. Hope had entered the room, but it was not gentle. It shook her. It made everything more dangerous, because losing after hope would hurt worse than losing without it. Denise pulled the first receipt closer and read the stamped corner again. Mr. Hale, do you recognize this authorization? Arthur looked at the receipt. For a moment, the only sound was the rain against the window. It had followed them all the way inside, softened by glass, but still there, steady as breath. His hand did not reach for the paper. He only looked at the faded stamp and the signature beneath it. Yes, he said quietly. Then he stopped. Elena waited for more. Denise waited. Grant waited too, though his patience had become something sharper. His face had gone still in a way that made stillness feel louder than speech. The room seemed to understand before he explained anything. This was no longer just Elena's booklet. It was no longer just her mother's receipts. Something old had risen from the paper and found the one man in the room who could not pretend he had never seen it. Arthur kept his eyes on the signature, and for the first time since the hearing began, he no longer looked like a neutral observer. Arthur did not speak again right away. That silence did more than any objection could have done. It stopped the room from moving forward. Denise's hand remained near the keyboard. Font's representative held his pen above the portfolio without writing. Elena sat with her fingers close to the old booklet, afraid that if she touched it again too soon, someone might decide she was being emotional instead of careful. Arthur looked at the faded stamp as if the small square of ink had opened a door he had spent years keeping shut. Then he straightened. File should not be closed today, he said. Grant turned his head sharply. His voice stayed polite, but the politeness had hardened. Mr. Hale, with respect, the buyer has relied on the city's posted process, timelines attached to this transfer. I'm aware of the timelines, Arthur said. Denise shifted in her chair. The issue is whether the receipts are enough to hold the file. No, Arthur said, firmly. The issue was the city accepted payments that were never properly carried into the current record. The room went still again, but this time the stillness had direction. Elena looked at him, trying to understand what had changed. He had not smiled at her. He had not offered comfort. He had not said the apartment would be safe. But something in his voice had moved the room from dismissal into examination. Rescue. It was a door opening an inch, and an inch, when a person was pressed against a wall, could feel like air. Denise pulled the first receipt closer. These are old desk stamps, Arthur nodded, fearing. Then they should be matched against the paper transfer logs. Denise's mouth tightened. Those logs may not be complete. That is exactly why the file cannot be closed without checking them. Representative leaned forward. You're asking to delay a lawful auction based on incomplete paper. Arthur turned toward him, asking the panel not to treat an incomplete digital record as complete simply because it is convenient. Elena felt the words pass through her like a quiet shock. Convenient. That was the word no one had wanted to say. It was convenient to see her mother as late. Convenient to see Elena as unprepared. Convenient to see an old apartment as an address, a balance, a unit, a future rental, and a sound fare. It was much less convenient to look at the little slips of paper and admit that someone had tried. Denise opened another screen. Clicking of her keyboard did too loud in the small room. She searched by account number, then by the old reference number, then by the partial payment amounts Elena had arranged in order. The first search came up empty. So did the second. Grant sat back slightly, as though the silence had begun to favor him again. Elena's stomach tightened. Arthur did not move. Try the former desk batch code. Denise looked at him. That code isn't in the current ledger. It may be on the scan header from the old system. Elena pulled the scanned packet toward her. Nora had made 2 clean sets, one clipped by date and one clipped by type. At the time, Elena had thought the second set was unnecessary. Had said extra order never hurt anyone when a room wanted a reason to ignore you. Elena found the copy, slid it across the table, and kept her hand there until Denise took it. There, Elena said. At the bottom, Denise read it, then entered the code. This time, something appeared. Not enough to settle the case. Not enough to make anyone exhale. But something. A batch record. A date range. Yelled. A group of payments transferred from the old desk into a holding file. Instead of the active account ledger, Denise stared at the screen for several seconds. Her face changed by degrees, the way a person's face changes when a problem stops being theoretical and becomes traceable. Grant's representative noticed. What is it? Denise did not answer him at once. Arthur did. A missing link, Dios. Elena looked at the screen, though she could not make sense of all the columns from where she sat. She only saw Denise scrolling now instead of dismissing. He saw Arthur watching the screen with the hard focus of someone who knew what one overlooked line could do. She saw Grant's hand close around the edge of his portfolio. The old booklet remained open on the table, fragile receipts lined beside the clean scans. The papers looked smaller than ever under the fluorescent lights. Yet everyone in the room had begun moving around them. Denise opened the original electronic ledger again. The account balance was recalculated after the transfer. But these amounts were not applied. Elena's breath caught. Denise quickly added, I'm not saying that resolves the full balance. I'm saying there is a discrepancy, seized on the word. A discrepancy is not proof of satisfaction. No, Arthur said, but it is proof the current record is unreliable. The sentence landed heavily. For the first time, representatives stopped looking at Elena as the obstacle. He looked at Denise, then at Arthur, then at the receipts. The quiet confidence he had carried into the room did not vanish, but it changed shape, became calculation. Elena kept her eyes on the row of papers. There were still gaps. She knew that. Her mother had not been perfect. Payments had come late. Some had been partial. Some notices had been folded so many times they looked tired. But the story the system had told was simple. Unpaid, unresolved, eligible for auction. Her mother's papers told a different story, not a perfect one, a human one. Denise searched again. There are more batch codes tied to the same desk. Elena reached for another receipt. This one may match the next one. Her voice trembled on the first word, then steadied. She placed the receipt beside its scanned copy and the notice that followed. The dates were not clean. The amounts did not line up in a way that made the room comfortable. But they spoke to one another. A payment appeared, then a reduced balance. A fee appeared, then another partial payment. A new notice appeared, then another old stamp. Piece by piece, the table became a map of effort. Arthur did not touch the papers. He asked questions, short ones, careful ones. Which notice followed this payment? Was there a matching batch number? Did the reduced balance show in any archived view? Could the old desk transfer have been coded as temporary instead of applied? Be to look at Elena when he asked them. That mattered to her more than she expected. He was not performing kindness for her. He was making the process look at what it had missed. Denise answered at first with hesitation, then with growing unease. This one appears in the holding batch. This one has no applied entry. This one was scanned but never attached to the account. Grant's representative interrupted. Even if staff handling was imperfect, the buyer cannot be penalized for city clerical issues. Arthur's eyes moved to him. Was your client notified that the file had a pending claimant? Grant's face tightened before his representative could answer. There it was. Small. Almost nothing. But Elena saw it. Grant spoke for himself this time. We were aware there was a review. A review, Arthur said, or a dispute over payment records. Grant adjusted the cuff of his coat. The city listed it as a review. We proceeded according to the available status. Dennis looked down at her screen again, and her shoulders sank a fraction. There is a note in the file that the claimant submitted additional paper records before the transfer lock was requested. Elena turned toward Denise. I submitted those weeks ago, she said. Denise did not meet her eyes at first. They were marked pending intake. Pending. Elena repeated softly. The word hurt more than she expected. Her mother's home had been moving toward auction, while the papers sat somewhere waiting to be seen. Representative closed the portfolio halfway, then opened it again. A pending intake note does not establish bad faith by my client. No one has used that phrase, Arthur said. Not yet. The room chilled in a different way. Grant's calm was still there, but now it sat on top of strain. He had come prepared to wait out a young woman with damp sleeves and incomplete records, unprepared for old desk codes, missing batch entries, and a former housing lawyer who remembered how the paper system worked. Elena did not feel triumphant. She felt shaken. Every new match gave her hope. Every hope frightened her. The receipts were no longer only proof that her mother had paid. They were proof that her mother had fought quietly for longer than Elena had understood. She thought of her mother at the kitchen table, smoothing bills flat with the side of her hand, writing dates on envelopes, saving slips in a library booklet. Because somewhere in her bones, she must have known that paper might one day have to speak for her. Elena pressed her palm lightly against the table edge. She didn't ignore it, she said. He answered. She had not meant to say it for the room. She had said it for the apartment, for Marcus. For every night she had wondered whether grief had made her remember her mother as more careful than she had been, or Arthur. Heard it. He looked at the row of receipts again, and the old signature at the corner of one of them seemed to darken under his gaze. Denise printed a summary from the archive search. The small office printer in the corner hummed, then pushed out page after page. She stood, collected them, and laid them beside the booklet. The payment chain is not complete in the current ledger, she said. Her voice was quieter now. There are enough matching entries to require further review. Grant's representative objected immediately. Further review cannot be open-ended. The auction process has statutory deadlines. Arthur did not argue with the word. He used it. Then the proper recommendation is a temporary hold, while the paper receipts, archived batch records, and pending intake note are reconciled. Denise looked at him. Will require panel approval, then ask for it. Elena looked from one face to another. She understood the words temporary hold. She understood further review. She understood enough matching entries, though them meant home yet. Not fully, not safely. Still, something had changed. The room no longer leaned only toward Grant. Denise turned back to the screen and entered a note. The sound of typing filled the silence again. This time, each keystroke seemed to slow the machine that had been rolling toward Elena's door. Grant stood partway, then sat again. His representative placed a hand flat on the portfolio. We reserve objection to any delay, or nodded once. Noted. The old word of procedure sat between them, plain and sharp, Alina gathered the loose receipts only after Denise made copies and returned them. She placed each one back beside its matching scan, yet into the booklet. The order mattered now. The sequence mattered. Her mother's scattered proof had become a chain, and Elena was afraid to break it even with her fistes. Denise looked at the printed archive pages, then at the row of old slips. We'll need the panel to decide whether to suspend the transfer pending reconciliation, she said. Grant's face turned still. Arthur leaned back, but his attention did not soften. He had opened the door. He could not decide what waited on the other side. Elena looked at the receipts, the scans, the auction notice, and the faded stamp that had pulled the room to a halt. These come closer than it had ever been, a final. But it was still only close. And while the paper trail now stood in front of them, the final decision had not yet been made. Denise did not read the recommendation quickly. She sat with the printed archive pages in front of her, the old receipts beside them, and the auction notice at the edge of the table, like a threat that had not yet been carried out. The room had grown quiet in a way that made every small movement feel important. Grant's representative had stopped tapping his pen. Arthur sat back with his hands folded, but his eyes stayed on the papers, not on the people. Tina stood inside that quiet and waited. She had thought fear would make her restless. Instead, it made her still. Her hands rested near the open booklet, close enough to protect it, but not touching. He could see the faded stamp on one receipt, the careful copies Nora had helped her make, and the notice that had once made the apartment feel already lost. All of it lay there together now, feel as if her mother had finally been allowed into the room. Denise looked up. Based on the receipts presented, the archived batch records, and the pending intake note, she said, panel cannot treat the current ledger as complete. Grant's representative straightened. We object to any indefinite delay. It won't be indefinite, Denise said. Her voice was tired, but it no longer rushed. Transfer will be placed on temporary hold while the payment chain is reconciled. The pending auction action is suspended. For a moment, Elena did not understand the words as victory. He understood them only as sounds that did not include losing. Suspended, hold, reconciled, not gone, not auctioned, not today. Her breath came in slowly, and when she let it out, the thing inside her loosened so suddenly that she had to grip the edge of the table. She did not cry. She did not thank everyone at once. Think alone. She did collapse into the kind of relief people expect from someone who has been cornered. She only lowered her eyes to the booklet and pressed her fingertips lightly against the cover, as if telling her mother the room had finally listened. Grant's representative was still speaking. My client entered this process in good faith, based on the city's status record. Arthur turned toward Grant. The beard was not clean. Grant's face remained composed, but the color had gone from it. We followed the posted process. Denise looked at her screen again. File shows your transfer lock request was submitted after additional paper records were marked pending intake. Grant did not answer quickly enough. It was not an admission. It was not a dramatic confession. It was something quite quieter and more damaging, a delay where confidence had been. He had known there was question around the file. Perhaps not every detail, perhaps not every receipt, to know. Elena's claim had not been fully reviewed before he tried to push the apartment forward. Denise continued, that request will be reviewed separately. Until then, your buyer status on this unit is removed from active consideration. Grant's representative leaned in sharply. Removed, pending review, Denise said. Panel will not proceed with a buyer who sought to advance a transfer while unresolved documentation sat in intake. Grant looked toward Elena then, not with apology, with the cold surprise of a man who had not expected a damp young woman with become a problem he could not step over. Elena looked back at him without speaking. There was nothing she needed to say to him. Receipts had said enough. Denise's hands moved to another page. She did not look as certain as she had at the beginning of the hearing. She looked smaller somehow, not weak, but aware. Handling of the intake record will also be referred for internal review. The sentence cost her something. Elena could hear it. Denise did not ask to be forgiven. Elena did not offer forgiveness. Not then. The loss had come too close for easy softness, but she saw, in Denise's lowered gaze, that the mistake was no longer hidden behind the word system. Someone's choice to move fast had met the consequence of being seen, or stood only after the decision had been entered. He did not reach for Elena's hand. He did not tell her he had saved her. He gathered his briefcase, then paused beside the table, and once more at the receipt with his old signature. I was wrong to trust a screen more than paper that had a person behind it, he said. It was not a speech. It was not enough to mend what had happened long ago, what had almost happened now. But it was the first honest thing he had offered all morning. Elena nodded once. My mother kept everything. I can see that, Arthur said. His voice changed on the last word. Only a little. The apartment did not become safe all at once. There were still calls to answer, forms to sign, copies to bring back, and weeks of waiting while the city corrected the chain of payments. But the auction did not go forward. Grant lost the unit he had expected to claim. Denise's file handling was pulled into review. The old deck records were opened again, and with Nora's scans beside her mother's receipts, the sound. Elena sat through one more meeting, and then another until the balance was corrected into something true. When the final letter arrived, Elena read it standing in the kitchen. Chris came in from school with his backpack hanging off one shoulder. He stopped when he saw her holding the envelope. For weeks, he had pretended not to know. She had pretended not to see him pretending. That had been their way of loving each other, when neither of them knew how to make the fear smaller. This time, Elena did not hide the paper. We're staying, she said. Marcus stared at her. His face changed slowly. He was afraid to believe too fast. Then he crossed the kitchen and hugged her so hard the letter bent between them. Elena laughed once, a broken little sound that was almost a sob. Careful. That's official. He pulled back and looked at the paper. Mom would framed it. She would put it in a folder, Elena said. They both smiled then, and the apartment felt different. Not new, not repaired in every place that hurt, but returned. Pencil marks on the hallway wall were still there. The narrow kitchen still had the cabinet that stuck when the weather turned damp. The window still faced the same gray stretch of city. Yet the rooms no longer felt borrowed. A short time later, Nora came by carrying 2 boxes of children's books from the library's donation shelf. She did not call it a project at first. He only set the boxes on the floor, near the entrance, and said the building had too many children, waiting in hallways with nothing to read. Elena looked at the empty corner by the stairs. That was how the first shelf arrived, then another. Marcus sanded an old wooden bookcase a neighbor had left near the basement door. Nora brought labels, library pockets, and a small sign. Elena made a check-out notebook from a plain spiral pad. Children from the building began stopping on their way home from school, shy at first, then bold enough to ask whether they could take 2 books instead of 1. The corner became warm before anyone meant it to. There came one afternoon, with a box of legal pamphlets written in plain language and a stack of blank folders. He stood just inside the door, looking less like a man who belonged to city rooms, and more like someone learning how to enter a place without taking over. I thought these might help, he said. Elena accepted the box. They will. He looked toward the bookcase. A little girl was sitting cross-legged near the bottom shelf, turning the pages of a picture book with great seriousness. Marcus was helping a boy write his name in the checkout notebook. These were taping a crooked paper sign to the wall and pretending not to notice that it leaned to one side. Arthur took off his coat and stayed. Not every day, not loudly, but he returned. He helped people sort letters they did not understand. He explained forms without making anyone feel small. He checked old notices before they became emergencies. He never spoke about redemption. He only showed up, with reading glasses in his pocket, and time he had once guarded too carefully. Elena kept her mother's old booklet in the apartment, not in a locked box, but on a high shelf near the checkout notebook. The receipt stayed inside it. flat, and safe. Sometimes, when a child asked why the little library corner was there, Elena would touch the spine of the booklet and say it was because some papers were worth keeping. First rainy morning after the shelves were full, in the front door, she opened more door early and found 3 children waiting under the awning, their backpacks damp and their faces bright. Behind her, the building was warm. Hallways smelled faintly of old books and coffee from someone's kitchen upstairs. Elena stepped aside and let them in. Had fought sat. The place her mother had fought to keep had become a place other people could enter without proving they deserved to be there. And as the children gathered around the crooked shelf, Elena looked once at the old booklet above them and felt, for the first time in a long while, that home was no longer something she was only trying not to lose. It was something she could share.